NUFC Talk Radio.
The voice of the Toon Army. Live daily on the website, on YouTube,
on DAB,
and on every online radio directory.
NUFC Talk.
The voice of the Toon Army.
Hello and welcome back to Inside the Press Room here live on NUFC Talk Radio and NUFC Talk TV. And what an episode we have for you today, whether you're watching on YouTube or listening live on DAB. We'll be joined by the Athletic's Chris Waugh shortly enough to discuss the fallout of what was the Derby disaster at the Stadium of Light. And with Chris, we'll also be looking at Press Conference Pro, but we'll be analysing exactly what Eddie Howe had to say in the aftermath of the 2-1 defeat against Sunderland. And then, just before Chris leaves, we'll preview the international break. Of course, 6 England players now, with Harvey Barnes having joined up to the Three Lions from Newcastle United, which I believe is more than any other club, which seems a little bit surprising given just how poor Newcastle were in that derby against Sunderland. And then once Chris departs, we'll have some audience interaction. I'll look at some of your comments and see what you have to say, answer some of your questions just before the show comes to an end. I would just like to say thank you to everyone who is tuning in already. Please do like, subscribe, comment, consider becoming a member, and also if you are tuning in on YouTube or listening on TV, thank you already very much for being part of today's show. But after this short break, we'll bring in Chris Waugh of The Athletic, and we will get straight into looking at the 2-1 defeat to Sunderland, and then we'll get into Press Conference Pro to see exactly what Eddie Howe had to say following that match.
You are listening to
NUFC Talk Radio.
the voice of the Toon Army. Live daily on the website, on YouTube,
on DAB,
and on every online radio directory.
NUFC Talk.
The voice of the Toon Army.
So, thank you to Chris for joining us here, but as I said before we get into things, please do like, subscribe, comment, and consider becoming a member of NUFC Talk TV. And thank you to everyone who is already listening on DAB and tuning in live on YouTube. Chris Waugh joins us here live on the show. Chris, how are you on this Thursday afternoon in March, just a few days after, of course, what was, as I mentioned earlier, a derby disaster for Newcastle?
Yeah, well, I think it's a lot easier to compose my thoughts now than it was 4 days ago. The after effects of that are still being felt by everyone, I think, and I'm sure most Newcastle fans still haven't quite got over, if they will ever get over, seeing Newcastle collapse in quite that fashion in the second half, having also witnessed a very different collapse at Barcelona in the second half a few days previously. But yes, I'm not doing too bad, thank you. How are you doing?
I'm doing all right, because as I say, it's sort of trying to come to terms with it a little bit. We are a few days after the scene of the crime, but here we are. And we have to talk about it. That is our role as reporters. We can't just ignore it. We have to talk about it. So let's get straight into the game itself before we get onto what Eddie Howe said. Anthony Gordon puts Newcastle ahead 10 minutes into the game. I thought the first 10 minutes of that match against Sunderland, with War Flags having put out a fantastic display in the stands, Newcastle did have a bit of fight about them in that first 10 minutes. You could see they were trying to press Sunderland. And of course, the opening goal comes from Newcastle's press high. Voldemort wins the ball back, gives it Anthony Gordon, who sidesteps Luke O'Nien, who of course had given the ball away in the first place from the goal kick, and it's 1-0 to Newcastle. That, to me, showed Newcastle were up for the game at that point, and it showed they had a bit of fight and that the press was what they were trying to enact. And it did that at point, did you think that Newcastle were going to go on for a bit of a hammering for Sunderland in terms of, I thought if they got that early goal, it could have been a cricket score, and they got that early goal.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to try and rewrite history and pretend that I didn't say beforehand that I thought if Newcastle scored early, then that would suit them better and they'd go on to win. I didn't necessarily think cricket score like you, but I did think they would go on to win if they scored early. And as I'm doing sort of a live piece, which goes up just on the final whistle sort of briefing, which is analysing what's going on at that point, I'm having discussions with my editors, and I'm saying if there's one way I would advise any team to play against Newcastle, it would be not to play it out from the back when they're trying to high press with Anthony Gordon at the front, and that's exactly what Sunderland tried to do, and that's where Newcastle's opening goal came from. And you thought, 1-0 up after 10 minutes, this is exactly the start Newcastle needed. You see the momentum behind them, the War Flags display, the atmosphere was there, and I think that sort of lasted maybe for 20-25 minutes, and then gradually as the first half wore on, Sunderland didn't have loads of clear-cut chances, but Newcastle just sort of seemed to drop deeper and deeper off the ball, and as we've seen so often this season, unfortunately, Newcastle being ahead is when they're at the poorest, really. And just came deeper and deeper, kept losing the ball, and just never came back out for the second half. And it was so frustrating after the start that they had, that we all thought that they needed. They needed that sort of lift after the Barcelona game, but also that belief. And given it against a Sunderland side who had so many big injuries, you just thought, yeah, this is exactly the platform Newcastle need to kick on and win. And unfortunately, that was very much premature.
Yeah, well, let's just, before we get onto what happened at half time, and we can discuss this till the cows come home, but I just wanted to mention, as you say there, Sunderland sort of played into Newcastle's hands a little bit in the first 10 minutes, but if Newcastle had got that second goal, we saw Anthony Elanga go close, hit the side netting, we saw Sven Botman hit the post with a header. Do you think that might have changed the way the second half went? And also, just on top of that, how frustrating also is it the fact that Newcastle had over 7 days prior, gone to Chelsea and actually held the lead so brilliantly. Where, as you say there, this season, when they've been ahead at times, they have been really, really poor. But at Chelsea, they held that lead so brilliantly. And in a game like Sunderland, if they had got that second goal, do you think they could have replicated that, holding on to a lead, as they had shown against Chelsea?
Yeah, I think if Newcastle got the second, they would have probably kicked on and taken belief from that, and Sunderland probably would have lost belief. But I think the longer Sunderland were able to stay in the game, the more nervous Newcastle became, the more Sunderland grew in belief, and fatigue probably did set in for Newcastle as much as people don't want to necessarily hear about that. The Chelsea was slightly different, A, because Newcastle are away, and B, I just think the makeup of the two sides, Sunderland had a big physical centre forward, so therefore they could disrupt Newcastle in different ways. Newcastle did to Chelsea what Sunderland did to Newcastle, certainly at the Stadium of Light, which was just make sure you break us down then. Yeah, and Chelsea have very technical players who were playing it from one side to the other, didn't offer enough questions. Newcastle didn't move the ball quickly enough. And so I think there were slightly different games, but it is frustrating that is the one clean sheet Newcastle had in 15 games. That they've conceded so many goals across the course this year that they couldn't replicate that. Now, there's been a lot of discourse about should Howe have played Dan Burn and should Tino Livramento have started ahead of Kieran Trippier? Should Sven Botman have started alongside Malik Chow rather than to be Botman go to right side and Dan Burn? All of this is sort of after the fact. Before the game, I didn't think there was that much wrong with the lineup in itself. Afterwards, everything will be picked through rightly. The big call was in midfield, where they obviously didn't have the firepower that they usually would like, and not having Sandro Tonali and Bruno Guimaraes was a huge loss for them. But Sunderland were missing even more of their big players, and I just thought it was interesting afterwards that a lot of the talk was about Nick Voltemada's role, and how came out afterwards and was bullish about the fact that he played as number 10 and that he then pulled him after that, whereas a lot of Newcastle fans are talking about how he was definitely playing midfield and it didn't work. Well, wherever he was meant to be playing, and Newcastle fans are seemingly a lot would want him as number 10, if that was where he was meant to be playing, seemingly on the eye it didn't necessarily look like that, and it didn't work in practice beyond he did get that intervention for Newcastle's opener. And yeah, it just felt like the longer the game wore on, the more disjointed Newcastle became, and then even as the substitutions came on, it just became more and more frantic, as we've seen it far too often this season, really.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with what you're saying. And just on Nick Voltemada, I think that's an interesting point, because I could understand when I looked at the lineup when it came out why Nick Voltemada was in that, because everything Sunderland had sort of hinted at in the week leading up to the game was that they were going to try and follow the blueprint of how they played against Leeds at Elland Road when they won 1-0. And it was a very, a low block, it was very deep, and trying just, as Newcastle and Chelsea to an extent, trying to make things difficult. But actually, Sunderland, as much as they were a little bit tentative in the first 10, 15 minutes or so, they did actually start to play up the field a little bit quite quickly. And so that sort of made Nick Voltemada's role as that trying to, break down a deep line team a bit redundant, I'd argue, in that regard, because he is someone who you'd want to have those little intricate passes when you're trying to break a team down who's sitting deep. So to my point on that end would be, when Eddie Howe realised that Sunderland weren't sitting as deep as perhaps he realised, maybe it had been at half time, should Joe Willock have been introduced earlier on? Because when Sunderland are clearly pushing on ahead and trying to take the game to Newcastle a bit more, as they started to do very early on in the second half, Willock would probably be better in that regard, because he could then run into that space, whereas Voltemada is limited in that sense. Would you agree with that point?
Quite possibly, yeah. I mean, I just think that the shape possibly should have changed to the 4-3-3 earlier, or Newcastle should have tried something different. I mean, I think Voltemada as number 10 off Gordon is just an odd thought anyway. If you're going to play Voldemort, you'd have thought you'd have wanted a natural sort of centre forward. Otherwise, you've got number 10 trying to play in someone who really wants to be sort of stretching the front line and pressing high. I just don't like Joe Linton as a number 6 in like a double pivot as it was in a 4-2-3-1. I just don't think he's technically good enough in that regard. I think it restricted him, and some ways he didn't seem the Joe Linton of certainly the first part of 2026 anyway. In that match, he just didn't get around the pitch enough. And so, yeah, I mean, yes, he could have made changes earlier, but he should have made changes earlier. But as much as I'm saying that, the changes that he did make, and I think there's been this too often in recent weeks that when Howe has made a lot of changes, actually Newcastle have looked worse for it on occasion. They've become increasingly ragged all over the pitch. And so sometimes when he leaves it a bit longer, it might not necessarily be proactive. It might not necessarily make Newcastle brilliant going forward, but it also doesn't completely disrupt them. And I felt that when he actually made some of the changes, they did just become more and more ragged.
Yeah, I mean, there are some arguments that I see online that some of his changes this season have been a bit too predictable, like for like changes at times, and that's an argument that you've got to sort of leave to the manager in the moment, because you know he's the one who's seen the game from his point of view. So I'll leave the judgment from that regard to Eddie Howe to look over his own decisions. I just want to get to the half-time point and what happened after that, because so many times Newcastle have got to half-time. Well, we saw it against Barcelona, for example, and we've seen it on this occasion as well, where they've just capitulated massively. And I know, obviously, we've mentioned how they've capitulated when they've been leading, but what gets said at half-time, Chris? It seems... I know it's obviously... I'm pointing out to say that it's perhaps bigger than it actually is, because certainly Eddie Howe won't say go and capitulate at half-time, obviously not. But how can there be such a shift? Because you say there, Newcastle did get a bit deep towards the end of the first half, but it's not trying to say that they were terrible in the first half, because they weren't dreadful by any stretch. They were the better team in that first half. But then how can they go from one half? And I know you mentioned fatigue there, which it has to be counted in, because as much as people won't accept it, they did play midweek. Sunderland didn't have that, and they have had a lot more games of late than Sunderland have. But how can I think defensively especially, and sort of in the deeper lying midfield areas, they can just look so nervous and shaky, and I think defensively as if they'd never played football together before in their lives. You know, you were looking at the defence and they just looked wide open, and I know Brian Bromley had a big role in that as well, and in terms of drawing the defence apart a little bit, but they just looked, as I say, as if they never played football before, half of them. How does that happen?
Yeah, I mean, that's the big question. It's one thing that Howe hasn't been able to address, how his coaches have not been able to extract that improvement, and that's definitely what needs to be seen in the final 7 games of the season, when Newcastle are now going to have more time on the training field. They've conceded, I think it's 46 goals already in 2026, something like that, and a lot of those have been in the second half. Like, that hadn't conceded early in second halves and then also late in second halves, neither of which is a great combination. I think part of it is a lack of concentration in those moments, and whether that's, again, compounding from the fact of just so many games and sort of losing focus in those key moments. I don't know precisely, but Howe needs to find a way to stimulate his players so that they come out and they are ready and that they are on the front foot again, because they started the first half on that front foot pressing style, and that had disrupted Sunderland. But maybe you have to give Sunderland credit as well, and maybe they just came out better, and Newcastle couldn't quite cope with it in that moment, and it sort of overwhelmed them a little bit, and then maybe nerves took hold. I don't know precisely. That's the big question. And I think Howe's at a bit of a loss. That's the concerning thing. Is I think he's been at a bit of a loss as to what has become a consistent theme, but why has it become a consistent theme? And he always says that he didn't tell his players to go out and sit deeper, because he believes that the best form of defence for any of his sides is to go on and get a second or a third and to win it that way. And certainly, given how many goals Newcastle conceded this season, to rely on a 1-goal lead was never ever going to be safe for them, really. No,
and does that add to the point of that perhaps Howe needs to be more versatile with his systems, and that if one system isn't working, and perhaps, okay, it worked for the first 10 minutes in that game against Sunderland because they did press high, they did get the goal, but after that, when it started to change a little bit, how does he have to, as I say, be more versatile and perhaps be, you know, you hear shouts of this online all the time, be less stubborn perhaps to the 4-3-3 system that he has employed throughout his tenure at Newcastle?
Well, I mean, the irony on Saturday was that he had actually changed it, or he insisted he changed it. It was a 4-2-3-1, and then he had changed the 4-3-3, albeit it was after Sunderland had equalised that he did then make the change. I think that's been a lot of the problem a lot of people have had this season, is it tends to be after Newcastle have either conceded once or even fallen behind that the changes tend to come. So yeah, he maybe has to move away from that. I also ascribe the fact that he has gone with the 4-3-3 for so long that generally, if he's going to really try a new system to be the full new system moving forward, he's probably going to need more time on the training ground to do that. And he hasn't had that recently. He changed to 4-2-3-1 last week. I think that was almost due to personnel. Once Toon Army was out, he felt he had to do that. He had to try and get some creativity in the pitch, and that's why he played Voldemort the way he did. It didn't work. Certainly once the game went away from Newcastle, and Sunderland had just controlled the midfield, really, and Newcastle's midfield was pulled left, right and centre. But then by the time he brought on Joe Willock, that balance is not ideal anyway. Ramsey, Willock, Joe Linton, not ideal, but you've got the personnel that you've got at that point. By the time he did that, Sunderland almost had a grip on the game, and Newcastle didn't have enough technicians, I don't think, on the pitch. I mean, Ramsey, relatively good on the ball, but they didn't have Tonali or Bruno Guimaraes, who even admittedly themselves aren't always brilliant at sort of controlling a game and sort of taking the sting out of it or making sure that Newcastle get their foot on the ball. But I think if one of those two had been available, Newcastle would have had more opportunity to do that. Instead, the ball just got turned over far too often. And in that transitional style, with Newcastle looking increasingly lagging, increasingly nervous, it was Sunderland who sort of grew as the game wore on, and Newcastle just looked, I keep describing it all week as it was like a slow motion car crash in that second half. You could see what was going to happen coming from a mile away.
Well, that's the thing, yes, because it's not like Tottenham went and hit them for 6 in the second half, but you could just sort of get the feeling that they were growing and they were growing and they were growing. Obviously, Newcastle do have the disallowed goal that they scored, and if that's given, then perhaps the game ends differently, but that's obviously, it didn't happen, it was disallowed, so we can't dwell on that. Of course, Talby gets the equaliser from a corner, badly defended. It is what it is, but as I say, even at 1-1, Newcastle do have the chance still, with loads of time left, to try and regain some momentum. They don't do that, really.
I was just going to say on that, I don't think when you say it is what it is, I don't think it is what it. I don't think it can be dismissed as much. The reality and the shortcomings Newcastle have at the minute is they're playing a goalkeeper who's on loan, who they don't believe is any better. Who generally within the club they don't believe is better than the usual first choice goalkeeper. But the first choice goalkeeper has been dropped because he's made too many mistakes. So they have a second choice goalkeeper in goal who makes that mistake, and then up front they have the person who started the season as centre forward. They then spent £120 million on 2 centre forwards who theoretically were meant to be ahead of him, one of whom got on the pitch as almost like a Hail Mary right at the end of the game, and the other one who they've tried to convert into a midfielder. And that's the shortcomings that Newcastle have. It's very basic, but the two top ends and the back end of the pitch, the two most important positions on the football pitch, Newcastle aren't strong enough at the minute, and that's why they keep consistently losing these matches, because they're conceding too many goals and they're not taking the big opportunities when they arise. Because although Gordon took his goal very well, he also had 2 decent opportunities laid on, one of which he really snatched at and put over the bar. So
yeah, no, you're right in that. And then, of course, you've got the Brobby goal, as you say, sort of coming to the end of the game. Sunderland were certainly the side in the ascendancy at that point, and it was just really poor defending that's allowed that goal. You know, the ball goes through legs and then box, and obviously Brobby at the second attempt puts it home. Now, if we get into press conference pro, where we will look at what Eddie Howe had to say in the aftermath of the defeat. His description of the defeat in one word was painful. And then, of course, he was also asked about, points being dropped from winning positions. He said that he has huge regrets over that, and he added that we've become very passive and quite reactive. Obviously, it was painful. I think that painful is an understatement, to be honest, given the nature of the defeat. And I think on the points dropped question, that's an interesting one, because as you say there, it all just feeds into this whole narrative of this season where Newcastle just can't score enough when they're ahead to keep them ahead, and then keep conceding too much. It is this issue where both in attack and defence and in the goalkeeper, for example, they're just not good enough at the minute. Yeah,
they're not, and mentally they're struggling in those moments, and because it's not just in the Premier League as well. They've done it in the Champions League. They did it at Marseille in the Champions League when they had a lead and they threw it away. They did it away by Leverkusen when they managed to get themselves ahead and then still threw it away. It's happened too often, and for them to be top of the unwanted Premier League table, that is the points drop from winning positions, 22 now. Even half of those, and if they'd kept hold of them, Newcastle would be comfortably in the top 6, but they keep shooting themselves in the foot to a certain degree, and they do feel like they're own worst enemies at times, and the concern is that it almost looks like it's a self-fulfilling prophecy as well. Now you can almost see the players in those moments, and it's almost like a conscious, it's on their mind as it's happening. And how, as I said, he lost for words, and he wasn't trying to defend it, but he also doesn't seem to have the answers right now, and that is worrying to see, but it's also, you also feel from on a human level, because he came up and he fronted up after the press conference. He basically took all of the negative questions that came his way. Some of it was quite brutal. A lot of journalists would get accused in these moments of sort of being soft and not asking the hard questions. Well, a lot of hard questions were asked after that game. A lot of questions along the very same theme, basically, but just going back at him time and time again, just with slightly different words. And he took it all. He said, I'm not going to question any of the descriptive words you want to use on this front, and he sort of took it, but he had to, really, because either Newcastle had already lost the away derby in dire circumstances, really. They were abysmal that day. They were better for certainly half an hour last weekend, but then still found a way to lose it. They'd gone out of the Champions League in disastrous fashion. They're also below Sunderland in the bottom half of the Premier League at the moment. There's not much or anything that I think Howe could have said which would have really sugarcoated or tried to defend the position they're in. So he didn't try to do that. He fronted up and he accepted it. But now these 3 weeks need to be used wisely and productively, and Newcastle have to come back and they have to be better, because I think that at the end of the game, what you saw for the first time was at least a portion of the home crowd boo and really display their emotions after the match, make it clear that they weren't very pleased with that. And I think moving forward, if Newcastle struggle at home between now and the end of the season, I think that what you will see is that patience will wear thin, and that the fans probably will turn quicker now, and it's up to Howe and the players to make sure that isn't allowed to happen, that they wrestle back some of that momentum and just give them a bit of positivity heading into the summer. Because if they are going to stick with Howe, as they all seem to want to do, and they believe he is still a man for the long term, I do think that there needs to be a positive injection of momentum between now and the end of the season, because otherwise it'll just feel like it's a sort of slow road towards the end, which is not what anyone wants.
No, and can I just ask what you asked of Eddie Howe in that post-match press conference, and what was the answer he gave you?
Well, I actually went to the mix zone, and
I
came and joined the press conference about halfway through, and was sort of stood at the side at the back. But I'd gone to the mix zone, and I had messaged members of Newcastle's media department asking if anyone was going to come through the mix zone, because we waited for about 10 minutes, nobody had come through. The response was highly unlikely. And I didn't think that was a great look optics wise. I don't think that was just the players, to be fair. I think that was also the club almost trying to protect them by not putting them up. But in some ways, I think that the optics wise, that was just terrible. Yes, in one sense, I realised that whatever players would have said, probably nobody wanted to hear it. But at the same time, I think it would have been good for somebody to front up. The issue probably would have been the sort of same people over and over again. It probably would have been the likes of Dan Burton or someone like that who had been asked to come and front up, which is not fair that it's always the same people in those scenarios. Bruno Guimaraes did it after the away game. But yeah, so I wasn't actually... George Corkle, my colleague from The Athletic, was in there, and he did ask a question. He asked Eddie Howe whether he was embarrassed about the fact that they'd lost home and away to Sunderland, and Howe basically said, yeah, I'm not going to try and push back against any of that. So yeah, that's the reason I didn't actually ask a question.
That's fair enough. Now, just before we will have a short break, and then we'll go into, just before you depart, Chris, we'll preview the international break. We've got a question for you here from Roger, and Roger says, hi Chris, given how many players are missing in the next 3 weeks, how could that affect us? I presume he means injuries, or does he mean players who are away on international duty? Perhaps some specification might be good on that question, but even so, we'll try and answer it. If he means players going away, do you think that affects Howe's training over the next 3 weeks? And if he means injuries, I actually think Newcastle are meant to have some players back come the next game against Crystal Palace, are they not?
Yeah, well, theoretically, after the international break, Bruno Guimaraes, Fabian Schär, Lewis Miley should be close to being back. Sandro Tonali should be back as long as he returns from international duty okay. So I think that's a positive. There will be more options there for Howe. In terms of the internationals, it'll affect Newcastle to a certain degree, because Howe doesn't have the full 3 weeks with them. I mean, most of the players, the non-internationals have been off most of this week anyway, but they will return next week. It's really for the next week when they're away on international duty. Howe instead will call up quite a few of the under-21s. I mean, a lot of the under-21s like Sean Neave and Leo Shahar already train with them, but they'll have a few more of those just to increase numbers. But then they will have a full week post-international break, because they're not in the FA Cup, to have basically the full squad around. And I think that will be of a benefit. Yes, it would have been even better if they'd had a full 3 weeks, but the reality is that No club in the Premier League is going to have that. Everyone's going to have internationals. There are a fair few of Newcastle's players away, but by the middle to back end of next week, they will be back on Tyneside, and that still gives them far more training time, or a far bigger block of training than they've basically had the entire season so far. They hadn't had a midweek or weekend off outside of international breaks since between the first 2 games of the season until this point. So to have what will essentially be 7 to 10 days of training with basically the entire squad will be very welcome relief, I think, for Howe and his coaches.
Yes, now we'll get into that further in terms of the international break and players who are away. We'll have this short promo. Please do like, comment, subscribe. Thank you to everyone who's already watching on YouTube and listening on DAB. After this, we'll be discussing the international break.
You are listening to
NUFC Talk Radio.
the voice of the Toon Army, live daily on the website, on YouTube,
on DAB,
and on every online radio directory.
NUFC Talk.
The voice of the Toon Army.
Now, we do seem to have a comment here from Boki, and Boki says, "Is Howe being let off by the press? Should the questions not be more probing?" Now, Chris, me and you have both sat in many Eddie Howe press conferences this season, and I think it's fair to say that, when it's winning, when Newcastle have won games, okay, some of the questions are perhaps a bit more friendly, but certainly against Brentford, against Everton, and as you said there, against Sunderland, there has been a spiky element to it. I remember against Brentford, he looked emotional, didn't he, after the Brentford loss?
Yeah, he did, and he was emotional. I always find this. I get that in these moments it becomes that fans want harder questions, as they would put it, the big questions to be asked, the difficult questions to be asked. My response would be, what exactly did people want to be asked on Sunday after the game? The questions about whether he was embarrassed, whether it's acceptable for Newcastle to lose to Sunderland, whether it's acceptable for them to be where they are on the table. These were all asked. I also think in these situations, my immediate response would also be, do you want a question to be asked of Eddie Howe just so you can say Howe was asked this difficult question? Do you want to listen to the answer? And there's two, I think that they're subtly different, because you can ask a question in a way whereby you just expect someone to get annoyed or just bristle at it or give a rude response. Very rarely is Eddie Howe rude. He will usually answer questions. Or you can ask a question in a way whereby it might not be as direct as some would like it, but it might actually facilitate a response or elicit a response which you would want to hear. And I also think that I also believe that there's a degree of decorum about this. I think that you can ask difficult questions and you shouldn't shy away from doing that, but I also think there's a way and means of doing it, and sometimes I think the way questions can be asked, not just of Howe but of others, can be rude and not showing that decorum. There is still that professional decorum between the two of you. He is still there answering your questions. He's willing to do that. He's always polite. So that will be my response. That I do think he was asked very difficult questions after Sunday's game. If people have very specific points that they want asked, maybe not every single one of them was addressed, but there's a limit to the number of questions that you get. And also, if it's about the minutiae of specific tactics or certain things that were going on, you also have to remember that journalists who are in that room have also got work that they need to carry out and have probably been given a set parameters of what they're being asked to do. And if it's not something very specific on one issue or tactical issue or the like, then they're probably not going to ask a question directly about that there and then, because they have their own work commitments. So my response to that would be, I disagree, but I also get that in these moments, that is the accusation that is levelled at me and others and at other journalists who are in the room, that the hard questions, quote unquote, aren't asked.
Yeah, it sort of brings up this comment here from Trolls, and he says, "How is the press's darling?" Now, I think, is that in reference perhaps to the fact that, there have been still some supportive articles of Howe in the last few days. And I think the reason that happened is because, as much as what has happened recently hasn't been good at all, and no one's defending that, no one's trying to say Eddie Howe has been getting things right in these games, because obviously there has been issues. I think it comes down to the fact that, as much as we shouldn't always be looking towards the past and the past is gone, he is the most successful Newcastle United manager of the last God knows how many years. And that's the thing. So I think the journalists appreciate that, as much as things are bad and we can ask these questions, there has to be a sort of a slight context to the fact that, what else can be said in these situations apart from say that Eddie Howe's terrible, because clearly he's not, and he's done some brilliant things for Newcastle. So I think they're not necessarily just really like massively showing a sort of a PR support for him. They're just trying to level up what's good about Howe and also what's going wrong at the same time. So I'm not, we all think he's a nice man, and we all think perhaps, he's done great things for Newcastle, but that also doesn't mean that we don't still question him in this point. Would you agree with the way I've put that?
Yeah, I would. I mean, I do think that sometimes when people write either overly critical or in the moment of things like right now overly defending pieces of Eddie Howe, I also don't think that necessarily helps the narrative, because if people rightly were wounded and don't like what they're seeing on the pitch at the moment, then I don't think that you can write something within a context of balancing all different views. And even if you come out down on the you're more supportive of Howe or the opposite, you can do that in a way whereby you don't really belittle or make people feel like they have to question their own perceptions or views on something. And I think sometimes some of the coverage can be that. And yeah, I'm largely still supportive of Howe, but equally after last weekend, I think it's fair game for anyone who felt anything negative in response to that, however strong your emotions after the game. I don't think that there's been too often that these issues have been cropping up, but it feels like sometimes there can be narratives on both sides, which is just almost to make fans question their own views or feel like they can't have those own views that they hold themselves from what they've seen. So I do agree with you, but I also think that sometimes it isn't necessarily helpful. Maybe that's just because I'm not that confrontational sort of reporter in the way that I do things, that I have that view, but equally that's what that would be my diss. Sometimes I don't think that's helpful. And if the intention of some of those articles, particularly the ones in defence of Howe, or to really come out to bat for him, sometimes I actually think it has the opposite effect, because I think it entrenches people more clearly, because it feels like their views just aren't being taken enough into account, really.
And and that's why I think balance is so important in this regard as well, because we know what Howe's done for the club, but also, as I say, we're not trying to diminish the fact that things aren't good at the moment. But anyway, let's get on to the international break before we look at some more comments, and I'll let you go, Chris. Obviously, as we've mentioned already, we do have a bit of time off Newcastle at the moment. That doesn't mean we stop covering the club, but it is a bit of a break from football, which actually can be a little bit of a breather, can't it? Because gosh, it goes on. It's been a busy season even for you more. I mean, I tend to only do the home games because I do Sunderland the other week, but you've been all over the place.
Yeah, it's been absolutely hectic, and it's been great in so many ways that Newcastle have been in all these competitions and competing in all these competitions. But when results take a nosedive in the way that it ends, that it has over the last week in the last two matches, then yeah, it becomes suddenly you feel that fatigue coming on board. And I remember before the Barcelona home leg, going into the press conference and sort of turning, the press conference room before the match, and sort of turning to another journalist and saying, I get that people don't want to hear about Newcastle playing so many games and potential fatigue, but I'm not playing every week. I haven't even done every single game. I've done most of them, but I haven't done every single one, and I'm absolutely knackered coming into this. So it has taken its toll. In some ways, after what happened on Sunday, it would have been good if Newcastle had a match quite soon afterwards, because the narrative may have been able to change. Instead, the negative narrative is going to fester over these 3 weeks, and that in itself is not great. But at the same time, I do think everyone has needed a little bit of a rest and a little bit of reset, and as long as Newcastle come back and look better for it, then I think we can all be more positive after that. But that's a big if right now, because the way that Newcastle have been playing, I wouldn't bet on them winning at Crystal Palace even after this break. I just think it's not a ground which historically Newcastle have done particularly well at over the last decade, barring a COVID match. They also have to play Bournemouth at home the week after that, who Eddie Howe isn't yet to beat in the Premier League, his former club. And they've got to go to Arsenal later on the season as well. So although on Brighton, they don't have a great record against generally home or away. So although on paper, a lot of the fixtures look fairly kind, when you actually dig down into them a little bit more and add into it Newcastle's topsy-turvy form, then suddenly you start to think, not sure where those wins are coming from.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with that, in the sense that it's nice to have a bit of time off, but there is sort of this at the back of your head that they've still got to play a few more games, and the way things are looking, But even so, if we look at the England team, Newcastle have 6 players represented at the Three Lions. Now, that's an interesting one, because as I said before, that's more than any other Premier League club. With the addition of it was 5, I think that was ever with Man City, but now that Harvey Barnes has joined, I believe that is the most for any club. So it's interesting, isn't it, how Newcastle can have had such a poor time of it on the pitch of late, and yet clearly they have players good enough for Thomas Tuchel, who are all in contention to go to the World Cup in America in the summer. What do you make of that?
Yeah, I mean, I also think it's a record for Newcastle in their history. And I mean, it is an extended squad, so that when the squad does get narrowed down for the World Cup, I think most of them, well, a couple of those probably won't be in there. I'd be surprised if Aaron Ramsdale makes the cut. I'd be surprised if Harvey Barnes makes the cut. But the other four probably have a good chance of going. Gordon, you'd say, it'll definitely go. Lewis Hall, highly likely to go. I think same with Livramento, and then Burns probably sort of 50-50, maybe even 60-40 that he goes. So it shows that they have... I mean, Howe has a core of English players within that squad. I think there was 8 of the starters against Barcelona potentially were English. He has had that English core, and he has developed those English players, and most of those players have earned their first cap under him as well and developed under him. So it's a real positive in that regard. It shows that want to bring through homegrown players, not necessarily having come through the club's academy, but players who have come through. You've also obviously got Lewis Miley. You'd like to think in the future will be in the England squad at some stage. But moving forward, going between now and the end of the season, it's sort of irrelevant to a certain degree how many Newcastle players are in the England squad. If basically, at least my view from a Newcastle perspective is that Newcastle need those players to perform well for them. And it felt jarring, as wonderful as a moment as I'm sure it was for Harvey Barnes, he got called up the England squad. It felt a bit jarring that it came on the day Newcastle had just lost to Sunderland, and a few days after, well, I know it wasn't officially announced the day after, but the news broke on that day, and then a few days after the sort of the Barcelona second half debacle, and also the fact that over the course of today we've had Eddie Howe get nominated for Premier League Manager of the Month and Aaron Ramsdale for Premier League Save of the Month, and you're thinking, it's not really great optics-wise right now. It's wonderful individually for them, but really, if I'm just looking at it from a purely Newcastle-focused point of view, it's great. In one sense, Newcastle have 6 players in the England squad, but would it rather Newcastle were 4th in the Premier League and through to the last state of the Champions League and have 2 players in the England squad? Yes, I think I would. So it's just, that's from a purely Newcastle-centric, selfish point of view.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with that as well. Now, just before we let you leave, Chris, we're going to look through a few questions because there are a few that people are wanting you and I to answer before I then finish the show with some more audience interaction as well. We'll go to this one from Adam NUFC, who says, who was higher up the hierarchy, Chief Scout, Steve Nixon or Andy Howe? What is your response to that, Chris?
Well, in a hierarchical sense, it's not Chief Scout. That Steve Nixon's position is. His position is head of recruitment. Andy Howe's position is assistant head of recruitment. So theoretically, from a hierarchical standpoint, it should be Steve Nixon. Now, last summer, it was actually Andy Howe who was put in charge, surprisingly, of incoming transfers by the board. Once Paul Mitchell had left, so he then at least temporarily went above Steve Nixon hierarchically for incoming transfers. The way things work in practice, he is Eddie Howe's nephew. He is also someone who's worked in long term. He also seems to be far more aligned with what Howe wants in players and what he's looking for. And so I think maybe in terms of having the ear of Eddie Howe, there's no doubt that Andy Howe has more of an ear than Steve Nixon. So does that mean he has more power and influence? In practice, a lot of the time, probably yes. But theoretically, hierarchically, he is below Steve Nixon. So it is a weird situation there. I think there's no getting away from it, certainly after last summer when Andy Howe was put in charge of incoming transfers.
And of course, now you've got Ross Wilson to add into that, who is the sporting director as well. So it makes that dynamic just even that more difficult as well. Let's look at a super chat here we've got from Chris the American Magpie, who actually owns and runs NUFC Talk TV. He says, Chris, nice to have met you in Gosforth last month. Do you think that as Jordan is as passionate as they are, do you also think they would like to see Eddie Howe be more passionate when things are going wrong? I'm just going to quickly interject on that. I don't think it's in Eddie Howe's nature to be like that, and whether you want him to be or not, I don't think it would look right, perhaps. And as I say, we watch him in press conferences, we watch him on the touchline. I just don't think that's him. And as much as you might want him to be that, I don't think that would perhaps. I get what you're asking, Chris, but I'm not sure that would have any sort of benefit to them in the sense that if you have a man who's perhaps overly emotional in that sense, I'm not sure that would make things any better or any worse. Would you agree?
Yeah, I think I'd agree with that. I also think that one of the reasons Howe has been so successful at Newcastle for so long is because he is the opposite of that. Now, Keegan was emotional and really played up to that, and that's where he got his strength from. I actually think that Howe almost trying to cut through that emotion and be the one who can step back, and at what is a very emotional football club, very jumpy, highs are high, lows are very low. I think that's been his strength, and so for him to move away from that would be to move into the unknown. Maybe that could work for him in the short term, maybe even the longer term, but that would be very much going to the unknown. He's been at his best because he tries to keep a level head. He tries to stay away from the noise. He tries to cut through it a little bit. And so that him being unnatural, I agree. I don't think that would be to the benefit. I get why fans may want to see it in that sort of moment, but I don't know how authentic it would come across as, and maybe it would actually have the opposite effect of annoying people more.
Yeah, now I've got another one. It's an interesting one here. Eddie Howe and Andy Howe need to go. Steve Nickson has found a lot of talent and Eddie Howe ignores him, which is pathetic. Look at Ryan, who of course went to Bournemouth. And that also links into another question which I saw pop up before, which I can't find in the comment section. It's should also Eddie Howe perhaps have a refresh in his coaching staff? Essentially what they're saying is, does the club need a bit of a reshuffle perhaps come the summer?
I mean, possibly. The issue I've got with that question is that there's a lot of presumed knowledge in there. There's a lot of presumed knowledge that it was Steve Nickson who identified Ryan. There's a lot of presumed knowledge that Newcastle ever really were that strongly in for Ryan. I know there were reports elsewhere that maybe they were. Yes, he was someone they were aware of, but I don't think it's ever as strong necessarily as was out there. So I get the narrative, and I do get the fact that people look at last summer's window and really question it. And Steve Nickson has identified some very, very good players over the years. But so between them of Andy Howe and Eddie Howe, they were the ones who pushed for Sandro Tonali. They pushed for Anthony Gordon. They pushed for Tino Livramento at certain points. So I don't think it's necessarily as straightforward as that. I think Ross Wilson being there that theoretically should be of benefit, because he can then be the person who can. It's going to be the ultimate say will be with Eddie Howe as to who comes in, but Ross Wilson hopefully can take more views of both Andy Howe and Steve Nickson into consideration in the wider recruitment team, and then maybe come down with a slightly different recruitment list or final list of players than they have done previously. It's been a bit opaque how it's all worked previously, and I think that there needs to be a bit more collaboration moving forward. So I disagree slightly with the premise of the question, but I do agree partly with what needs to happen moving forward, and that's that the strategy needs to be clear. It needs to be led by the sporting director, albeit with the final say being with Eddie Howe, and that Newcastle just need to have a better window than they did last summer, which was ultimately that the outgoing business was possibly even more damaging than the incoming business, and beyond what they actually did in the transfer window, what they couldn't do and had to defer for 5 windows before that, they are also still feeling the after effects of, because they could only do a certain amount last summer. Yeah,
and can I just sort of to wrap things up with you, Chris, before I let you go, because I know obviously you've got lots of things on. When you look at last summer, and I get a lot of people blame Howe because, of course, as you say there, he did have final say, and you've got all these players who came in to an extent who haven't worked this season. But is there some mitigation, and is Howe alleviated of some blame in the sense that the club weren't perhaps fast enough to act in getting a new sporting director in, they weren't fast enough to act in getting a new CEO in, which made last summer really difficult because, you know, we saw what happened with Isak. They briefed all summer that he was staying, and then he wasn't staying. Of course, he left towards the end of the transfer window, well, actually on deadline day, to be honest. So, as I say, Eddie Howe certainly wasn't helped by those situations. So would you say that blame has to also go to those above him who didn't put the structures in place, and leave it down to Eddie Howe and Andy Howe and Steve Nickson completely last summer, when realistically they should have had more people in to make that structure a lot more efficient and effective?
Yeah, for such an important window, Newcastle shouldn't have had no sporting director. It was very unfortunate the situation they had with Darren Eales and his illness, but they didn't have an executive structure in place, so there is mitigation in that regard. There's also mitigation. I mean, you mentioned that Newcastle were briefing about Isak not going anywhere. It wasn't just the case they were briefing until 48 hours left in the window. Alexander Isak, the stance all summer had been that he wasn't going anywhere. Basically, it only changed in that last week of the window when on the day of the Liverpool game, when they went to his house and he basically refused, and then they buckled. But up to that point, the position being Alexander Isak was going nowhere, and that hamstrung Newcastle from the very off, because they basically couldn't move too decisively on other regards because they didn't have the Isak money yet. They didn't know if the Isak money was going to be coming. They didn't know if he's come back into the squad. And so, yeah, there is a lot of mitigation, but eventually people don't want to hear about mitigation. Eventually people just want to see results and the outcome of it. And I think the fact that Anthony Elanga has struggled so much when Newcastle really wanted him, albeit Brian Mbeumo was first choice, they still did want Elanga. They won in previous windows, that he hasn't worked out, is a stick which Howe will be beaten with for now, and to a degree justifiably so. I think the other transfers, there's a degree more of mitigation. As much of a panic buy as Johan Wissa was in the situation Newcastle were in by that stage, I get that one more. that it hasn't worked out as of yet, but I also get why they did that. The problem at the moment is that Elanga was someone that he wanted and that they thought was going to solve a problem, and unfortunately it hasn't worked out as they wanted it to, and that's where, for all the mitigation you can afford them, that's a bit of a problem right now, because they need Elanga to be the one to perform, and he was supposedly one of the Premier League ready players, and it just hasn't worked out that way. I can't hear you anymore, Dan. Sorry, I don't know if that's me or if that's you.
Sorry, that was me because I'd accidentally pressed the mute button. Whoops. No, just a question there with Ashworth and Mitchell as well, and how was working with them. With regards to Mitchell, I know obviously that Howe and Mitchell, famously did not get on, but with Ashworth, from what I can remember, they seemed to be okay, and that was more Ashworth's decision to leave of his own accord. Am I right in saying?
Yeah, I mean, Howe came up with some very strong remarks immediately after Ashworth left, and I think that's because he felt a bit let down because I think Ashworth had been saying privately that he wasn't going to leave to go to Manchester United, and then obviously that situation arose. So I don't think that's necessarily a fair one. I think that more's painted by the way that Howe reacted once Ashworth left. It wasn't Howe who facilitated Ashworth necessarily going. They did have a strong working relationship, and subsequently I know that Ashworth has talked about him possibly being involved with England and the like privately, so he could see him being involved in there. He's quite happy to work with him moving forward. Mitchell, very different. Yes, the two of them did not get along professionally, certainly to begin with. They found a sort of uneasy working relationship moving forward, but part of the reason why Mitchell left was that, as well as the fact that his boss in Darren Eales was having to step down, and so he didn't want to continue in that position in that regard. So yes, Howe, in terms of selecting a sporting director, it definitely wouldn't have been Paul Mitchell, but I think the misnomer about last summer is that Howe was happy that Mitchell left when he did. The reality is quite different, because he knew that Newcastle needed a sporting director going in that summer, and instead they were sort of left in the lurch by not having someone, and so he would rather have had, despite the issues he had with Mitchell, he'd rather have had him in place than him not be there last summer.
Yes, now that brings to an end our section with you today, Chris. Thank you very much for joining us. As I say, I'll be continuing the last 50 minutes of the show, but I know you've got obviously things to do for the rest of the day, and of course you should go off and enjoy the international break as much as you can, because let's be honest, it has been knackering, the whole season, as I say. So anyway, thank you, Chris, for joining us, and after this short break, I'll be back for the final 15 or so minutes of the show to have a look through some more of your comments and try and answer them myself as well. But for now, Chris, thank you for joining, and please do like, comment, subscribe if you are listening on DAB. Thank you for tuning in, and if you are watching on YouTube, thank you for watching. Please do continue to like the show. But after this break, I'll be back on my own, and Chris will be without us anymore.
You are listening to
NUFC Talk Radio.
the voice of the Toon Army, live daily on the website, on YouTube,
on DAB,
and on every online radio directory.
NUFC Talk.
The voice of the Toon Army.
Well, we are back now, and it is only me. Of course, Chris has departed the show, but as I say, a fantastic insight from Chris Waugh there of the Athletics to just what is the situation at Newcastle at the moment. Not just looking at that Derby defeat, of course, but also looking at Newcastle as a whole, the ins and outs, and in terms of what really is going on at Newcastle. Now, please do keep the comments coming. I'd like to answer some more of your questions from my point of view as well, because, of course, I also enter the press room at Newcastle, and I do cover the club on a weekly basis too. So let's have a look through some of the comments that have gone through. With regard to the Mitchell thing that Chris has just mentioned there, was he not fit for purpose? Obviously, that was the comment that Paul Mitchell made about Newcastle's transfer policy in the public domain. I sort of can understand what Mitchell meant by that, but I don't think that was something that needs to be said out loud. After clearly it was obvious that Eddie Howe and Paul Mitchell weren't getting on, to say that just made the whole situation 10 times worse, and it was never going to sort of repair itself after that. So as much as Paul Mitchell may have been right to an extent with that point, I don't think that was well received inside the club. I don't think what a lot of Mitchell said was received well inside the club. Certainly he made a claim that Peter Beardsley would never have survived in the modern game, or not have been good, or something to that extent, or along the lines of that at least, which I think is at least in my opinion, is slightly laughable. So as much as you can understand what Paul Mitchell said to an extent there, it shouldn't have got out into the press, and I don't think everything that Paul Mitchell said is brilliant in that regard. So I think Mitchell leaving, it did damage to the club in terms of him coming in and leaving when he did leave, but I don't think perhaps he was, in the sense, the best fit for Newcastle, just with his approach to the club. Yes, as I say, what he said in that regard may have had some truth to it, but I don't think it needed to be said out loud in the public domain. Anyway, let's go through some of the further comments that are coming in. Let's have a look. Let's have a look from this comment here. That was very interesting on the Nixon Andy Howe situation. Confirms why it all went pear-shaped. Nixon foolishly overshadowed by Howe's nephew. Yeah, it is an interesting one that obviously Andy Howe, he was head of recruitment, or had the final say. Well, not the final say because Eddie Howe has the final say, but was perhaps at a higher standing last summer, even though Nixon is, as Chris alluded to, theoretically the one who was placed higher in the hierarchy at Newcastle. So it is an interesting one how that works. What I will say, and what Chris mentioned earlier, is the fact that it should, with Ross Wilson now in the club, be a lot more smooth and a lot more efficient and a lot more effective in terms of the transfer recruitment policy that Newcastle enact this summer, because without a sporting director, which they didn't have last summer, it was a bit higgledy-piggledy, and that's perhaps shown in terms of who was brought in and why it didn't really work to the extent that it should have worked. With a sporting director, that should make sure that everything else is kept aligned and uniformed in terms of who comes in, and of course who also leaves the club as well, because I think that's just as important, because let's be honest, we know that Newcastle are going to have a lot of outgoings this summer, whether it's Sandro Tonali, whether it's Tino Livramento, whether it's Anthony Gordon, whether it's anyone else. We know there's going to be outgoings. It is going to be a transitional summer. Newcastle have to be prepared for that, and they have to get it right. As much as they must get right who comes into the club, they must also get right who leaves the club, and make sure that the whole system and the whole department is uniform and on the same page and is working efficiently and effectively. So let's have a look at some more comments coming in as well. Let's have a look through the comments. Daniel, am I Eddie Howe in or Eddie Howe out? Good question. I'm going to say certainly last week when I said, a lot of things about how I was still very supportive of Eddie Howe, that is still very much the case in my head at least. But I will say that Sunday was really poor and it made me question a lot of things. But it is what it is. And I think whether I'm still Eddie Howe in, yes, to an extent I am. I think that he deserves the season and perhaps the summer to make things right. As Chris says, he was sort of the same rough mindset. But Eddie Howe certainly has perhaps used up some of his credit in the bank. Now, I'm just seeing some breaking news as well from Liam Kennedy reporting that Tonali has an agreement with the club. And I am just reading this now from Liam Kennedy, which is a really good scoop from him. Let's have a look here. Let's read it on Twitter. Exclusive from Liam Kennedy. Sandro Tonali expects to leave Newcastle United this summer. Agreement with the club. He can exit if the Magpies miss out on Europe. This gentleman's agreement, and we've heard that plenty of times before, haven't we? That could define Newcastle's summer transfer policy. A really good exclusive from the Shields Gazette here from Liam Kennedy as well. So let's have a read of it. And he does stress that they have a gentleman's agreement. If Newcastle fail to qualify for Europe, he can leave. So it all sort of depends on whether Newcastle, as I say, qualify for Europe. So that's a big breaking news this evening here. So what do we all make of that? Obviously, you can judge Tonali on that, but also you can judge Newcastle in the sense that they have to get to Europe, in the sense that Tonali, therefore, if they qualify for Europe, he may stay. But also, he may also go if they do qualify for Europe. So it's an interesting one, but I think it's a really, really good piece of journalism there from Liam Kennedy. And also, what sort of fee would you be happy with if Sandro Tonali was to leave Newcastle United? Because, of course, he was bought in the summer of 2023 for £55 million. What do you think he's worth now? Put that in the comments, please. Let's have a look at some more comments as well. Chris saying we will be covering this in depth from 8 p.m. to 11 p.m. tonight. I will look forward to that show, Chris. Really looking forward to all of what's coming later on this evening, of course. You'll be mentioning Sandro Tonali, no doubt at all. Yeah, I just think Tonali's an interesting one. Certainly, he hasn't been as good as he was last season. Let's be honest there, he hasn't. But he has been missed by Newcastle in these last few weeks when he's had the odd little injury issue. Let's have a look at a comment here. Trolls says Tonali's a £100 million player. Geordie Dan says, I think if we don't get Europe, Howe may go too. What a mad end to the season it's going to be. Yeah. Sorry, yes, Trolls. I assumed you meant millions. Yes, yeah. Question then, my next question to the audience is, will Newcastle make Europe in any form? And by that, I don't mean Champions League, because I think that's gone. I mean Europa League or even Conference League, which could, theoretically, depending on who wins the FA Cup, go down as far as 8th. Now, I know Newcastle are 12th, and of course they do have a bit of a points deficit to make up, but could they scrape 8th at the very least this season and get into Europe? That is my question to you this evening as we draw towards the end of today's Inside the Press Room show. What do we think? Let's have a look at some of the comments as well. Don't hit nothing less than 85 million for Tonali, 100 million for Premier League teams. Yeah, I think for European sides, he probably is worth less because, let's be honest, European sides probably don't have much money to offer Newcastle. Premier League sides, they will, let's be honest. Yeah, Travoy says we won't make European football in any way, shape or form. For me, the way we play and how we aren't getting Europe at all. Let's have a look at should we have a look at the Premier League table at present to see exactly how many points off Newcastle are in terms of 8th place. Let's have a look. Newcastle are currently 8th is Everton on 46. Newcastle are 4 points behind. So, do Newcastle make up 4 points on Everton? That is the question. Can they do it? But as I say, that may not keep Sandro Tonali. It may, but it may not. But according to Liam Kennedy, the gentleman's agreement suggests that Newcastle will only let Sandro Tonali go as an agreement if Newcastle fail to make Europe. So, what do we make of that? Comment coming in here. If we don't beat Brighton and Bournemouth, but if we can pick up some wins, it perhaps is possible. I think it is possible. I think it's possible. Whether they do it or not, we shall see. Of course, we can't ignore the derby, and me and Chris, as we did in the early part of the show, we got into that in a lot of detail and just how poor it was and how poor Newcastle have been. But is it possible that Newcastle hit these last, 7 or so games of the season with those weeks between games? And I know we'll get into the argument as well of that Newcastle can't just be a team who's playing from one week to the next. If they want to be elite, they have to get better at coping with the midweek games. But just for now, at least, can they attack the last part of the season? Can they get rid of the mentality issues? Can they get rid of the defensive issues? Can they start scoring more goals? It all remains to be seen. Let's have a look at some more comments. We can do it if they want it badly enough. All depends on the players on the pitch with the execution. I agree with that comment completely. It may not look likely after the debacle of Sunderland, but I think it's possible. And that is perhaps the best way of ending today's show. What a show it's been. Thank you all very, very much for listening. If you have been listening on DAB, if you've been watching live on YouTube, we've got some great numbers watching at the moment. We've got also some great interaction coming in the comment section. So thank you to everyone who has commented today. Thank you to everyone who has watched today. And thank you to everyone who has listened live on DAB today. Been a fantastic show. I must give my thanks once again to Chris Waugh of The Athletic for joining. His insight is fantastic. He really is one of the best in the game when it comes to covering Newcastle United. His insight and his range of contact and knowledge is really very good. And I would encourage you, if you aren't already following Chris on social media, please do follow. If you aren't following me on social media, please do as well. My Twitter, or X as it is these days, is at DanielWales023, which is also the same on Instagram as well. Please do drop me a follow. I haven't actually plugged myself too much on these shows so far, but considering we've got some good numbers watching, please do drop me a follow. Also drop Chris a follow on Twitter X as well if you already haven't. Also, if you're on TikTok, please give me a follow on there as well. At Daniel Wales Journalist. I do some great, or I like to think it is, some great content on there too. But as I say, please do drop me a follow everywhere you can. And we will be back next week with Inside the Press Room to look at what's happened over the international break. Because, of course, England will have played twice by the time we next come on to this show. And we will look at which Newcastle players have played for England over the last week or so. Anyway, let's have a look at some of the comments before we do depart. Thank you, Daniel. Thank you very much as well. Great show. Thank you very much for everyone for listening, for watching. I do really, really appreciate it. Very much appreciated, everyone, for watching. And we will catch you next week on Inside the Press Room on NUFC Talk TV and NUFC Talk Radio. Thank you, obviously, to Chris, the American Magpie, who makes this all possible as well. We can't go a show without giving him a little shout out, of course, for his comment earlier, and of course for setting up this whole enterprise. It is really very much appreciated. But until next week, where we'll be back on Inside the Press Room, thank you very much. Please do drop me a follow on social media, and until then, we will catch you next time. Thank you for watching and for listening.